Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins. Let's delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition.
Hello and welcome to the Sound Bites podcast. I'm your host, Melissa Joy Dobbins, a registered dietitian nutritionist. And today's episode is about consumer psychology, the business of food, food systems in this current pandemic and looking into the future, post-pandemic, if you will. You know, what we buy at the store, how unemployment rates are going to affect some of our choices, and again, how what we think and feel translates to what we're doing at the grocery store. My guest today is Jack Bobo. He is the CEO of Futurity and describes himself as a food evangelist. He is a former senior advisor for global food policy at the U.S. Department of State, and this will be his third time on the Sound Bites podcast. Welcome back to the show, Jack.
Thanks for having me. It's really great to be here.
I'm really looking forward to talking with you. For those who have not heard your previous podcasts, you were on episode number 132, talking about the future of food, science, policy, and values. And also way back in episode number 43, the surprising truth about sustainable agriculture. But for those listeners who haven't heard you before, haven't had the pleasure, please tell us a little bit about your background and credentials, because you have quite an interesting background, including a law degree.
Yes, well, I have undergraduate degrees in psychology, chemistry, and biology, and a master's in environmental science, and then a degree in law. But I always tell people not to be too impressed because my wife has the PhD in our family.
She's Dr. Bobo?
She is.
That's awesome. Very cool. Well, I'm impressed. Ever since the first time I saw you speak, I was just like, oh my gosh, I have to talk to this guy some more. I need to learn some more. I learn so much every time I talk with you. And in all honesty, just being honest with our listeners, we had some other things on the agenda for our conversation today, but you know, you really felt like there's some really interesting things going on that we could discuss about the future of food in a different way, again, with regard to coronavirus, COVID-19, and the current pandemic. So I was totally game for, let's talk about this, because I am really interested to hear your insight and perspective. Maybe a good place to start would be to explain a little bit more about the current work that you do with regard to consumer psychology and, you know, maybe your mission about the current food situation, which really a lot of things are changing with regard to what we fear and what we feel. There's a huge shift, but it all comes back to that consumer psychology, which you're really involved with. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for about the last year, I started my own consulting firm, Futurity, and I'm working with small food tech startups and big food brands to help them understand what does the future of food look like, where are consumer trends and attitudes going, and how do you get ahead of those trends so you don't get run over by them. And a lot of the reason for doing this is my personal mission, which I describe as how do we de-escalate that tension in our food system so that we can each get about our business of saving the planet in our own way. Too often it seems like people are more interested in tearing down the people on the other side rather than building up their own products and brands. And unfortunately, that undermines consumer confidence, not just in the products they go after, but in our entire food system. And this can easily be seen in the fact that consumers have never been more scared of the food they eat, and yet our food has never been safer.
Yes, exactly. I was thinking about that in preparation for our conversation today and thinking about, you know, some of the things that we've talked about before about why we fear the food we eat and how safe our food supply is. And you've kind of been using that phrase. Consumers have never been more scared of the food we eat. And like that is just at a whole new level right now. I just did a recent episode with Dr. Taylor Wallace about kind of helping reassure people about coronavirus, COVID-19, and food safety from, you know, can you get it from food to how do we have safe food handling practices? How do we handle food safely at the grocery store, at home, and all of that? So I wanted to mention that for anybody who hasn't heard that episode. But you and I are going to focus not on that so much, but on, again, that consumer behavior. So walk us through a little bit with, you know, I've seen things shift so much. You know, just a few weeks ago, we were talking about stocking up our pantries and in Illinois, we've been sheltering in place for 2 weeks now, and we kind of had a good week or so of that sort of on our own prior to that. And now we're supposed to be staying put through April 30th, at least as far as we know right now. And that could change tomorrow. But things are rapidly changing. So can you kind of walk us through what you've seen from a consumer behavior and consumer psychology standpoint?
Yeah. So, I mean, part of what you and I had talked about before this was that I have this series of articles that are coming out all about consumer psychology and helping people understand why it is that people often are worried about the food they eat. And those same consumer psychology principles are relevant today in talking about COVID and the current pandemic. And I think we're all familiar with the panic buying that was taking place over the first week or two of the situation. And when I went into the grocery store, it was interesting because the first week I went in, all of the beef products were gone, except for the grass-fed super premium products. And then the second week I went in and all the poultry was gone and some beef was back on the shelves. Now, it could be that people had stocked up on beef products and felt like they were ready to move on to poultry. But I also think that what is happening here is that, people bought what they thought was good value with the beef products if this was going to go on. But then after a week, they realized, well, I'm out of work and I don't know when I'm going to go back to work. And so then they thought, well, I need to be a little bit more careful in what my purchases are. So there's that transition. And over time, I think people are going to have to be more and more cautious about, how they spend their scarce dollars.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also the psychology of this, why are people doing it? Well, a lot of it is about taking back control. And, people are asked to sit in their home and, that feels like having absolutely no control whatsoever. So at this point, really the only control we can take is in what we purchase. And so we go into the grocery store and we're able to use a little retail therapy and regain some of that control. So there's a lot that's going on in how people are purchasing. Now, when it comes to all of the discussions around toilet paper and other things like that, that's just people following the herd. They see that somebody has a big basket full of toilet paper or other paper products, and they feel like, well, maybe they think I don't even need it, but what if they're gone?
Right.
So in that sense, it's actually a very rational thing to do. If other people are stocking up, you just have to do it before they're gone. But then people also just follow along with whatever the herd happens to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interestingly, I heard that because toilet paper is so bulky, it was more noticeable that it was off the shelves, and maybe same with bottled water. And I thought that was interesting. But yes, we hear a lot of mixed messages. Like, it's safe to go to the grocery store. You can go whenever you want, but then, stay at home. Don't stock up. Well, if I don't want to go to the grocery store very often and I want to stay at home, then I do have to stock up a little bit, but don't hoard. And, it's a very crazy time right now. But I really appreciate your point about taking control. And I feel that, I've always said, and I say frequently on the podcast, that because I grew up a little bit food insecure, I don't know if a little bit is the best description, but if you can be a little bit food insecure. So these days, if I go to the grocery store, well, pre-coronavirus, if I go to the grocery store, I feel like the richest person in the world if I can just buy whatever I want. And I did go through a little bit of the panic buying. At first, we weren't doing that because we already have a really well-stocked freezer and pantry. And I was just honestly telling myself, just relax. When you get more information, you'll feel better. And then it was a couple days after Trump said no European travel. I thought, okay, there's some basics I need to get at the store. And while I was there, I was like, well, I might as well grab this and I might as well grab that. And I saw, interestingly, there was no dried pasta on the shelves. I thought, that's very interesting. And honestly, when I left the store, I had a lot more in my cart than I originally planned on. And I felt a little crazy. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to get home and my husband's going to be like, you have lost your mind. And so I'd said to my daughter, forget Panic at the Disco. This is Panic at the Costco, because I felt like a crazy woman. We relaxed a little bit after that, but definitely feeling some sense of control in all of this uncertainty. It makes so much sense that you said that.
Yeah, and I think, what's going to happen over time is that the panic buying is going to be done. People will have purchased the things that they need and they will have stocked their shelves. And then the financial reality is going to start to hit home. What happens when, if you have 3.5 million Americans that have already started filing unemployment claims, and that's just in the first couple of weeks. 6 weeks from now, those numbers are going to be much, much higher. And, there are many, many Americans who are living paycheck to paycheck. And
yes.
After 2 weeks, they're not going to have a paycheck.
Right.
And so that's going to change a lot of the buying habits, and then that's going to ripple through the entire economy because the food products that people aren't buying, well, people were producing those too.
Right. Yeah, I found it very interesting. As a dietitian and a former extension specialist, I thought, I always have non-fat dry milk at home, but I don't use it very often. But I thought, I need to get some of that. And that was completely gone, but probably because they only had a few boxes anyway, because people don't use it. Right. So talk to us a little bit about, like you said, once the panic buying is slowing down and the financial realities are sinking in, how we might see different purchasing behavior, and also maybe from the retail or the food systems standpoint. I've seen some really good articles about, like, don't freak out, we're not going to run out of food, but certainly our food system, food chain is going to be impacted.
Yeah, and it's going to have probably some really surprising impacts and things that people aren't expecting. So, we can expect in some ways for poultry, beef, other products to become more expensive, not because companies are trying to take advantage of the situation, but because there's going to be a squeeze in supply, because it only takes 1 or 2 production facilities in the United States to shut down because, they're not considered essential personnel. And an example of this was a couple of years ago, there was a fire in one of the beef facilities shut down in the United States that packaged only 5% of American beef, and that caused beef prices across the country to go up. But on the other side of that, the people that were raising livestock, they actually saw all of their values go down.
Yeah.
Because they didn't have any place to send the animals.
Right.
So you end up in these strange situations in which consumers are paying a lot more money, and the people who are producing the food are getting paid less money.
Yeah.
So that sends a signal to them, I shouldn't produce as much next year. And yet there's actually greater demand. And so I think there's a good chance that we're going to see this throughout the entire supply chain, where at the grocery store, people are, worried about getting the food, but, just a few facilities across America start shutting down, and you're going to have that disconnect between demand and supply.
Yeah, that's really where the economics get really fuzzy for me. Do you think there's going to be much of a shift in, obviously, we're looking for budget-friendly foods. We're looking for, getting the most bang for our buck, as I always talk about, eating healthy on a budget. But with regard to perishables, non-perishables, or is it, snack foods versus what we might consider more essentials? Do you have any insight with regard to that?
Well, I think that early indications are that people are not searching for the snack foods and filling up their baskets with donuts and cakes and other things. And if they're not doing that during the first week or two, they're probably going to be even less likely as money actually gets a little bit tight. I think, the first week or two, one could feel a little bit like it's an early spring break. But, 2 months into this, and it's certainly not going to feel like that anymore. And that's where I think it begins to have a longer term impact on consumer buying behavior. And we've got, a lot of experience with recessions, and recessions have an impact on each generation. But this situation, it's more like a 9/11 happening in slow motion.
Mm.
And that's why its full impact hasn't been felt. But, 9/11, a few thousand people died, and it had that dramatic immediate impact. We've had 1,000 people die. We will, almost certainly have, a number more. And, the president the other day said that it's not inconceivable that 100,000 people die. So if we're having this conversation 6 months from now, 9 months from now, in 20, 30,000 Americans have died from this virus, and people are still out of work or haven't gone back to full employment, then I think people are going to question what is good value in food, and they're going to think about it differently. And that's going to mark this entire generation. I have children that are 16 and 18, and they're going to think about everything differently, as they go on to college. And so it's likely to have some pretty dramatic impacts on consumer buying behavior for many, many years to come.
Yes, as you're talking, I am trying to let it sink in what you're saying, because it's a lot. You're right. It's traumatic. My son's going to turn 12 in a couple weeks. And although in the past, I have cocoa and sugar, and making a cake at home was something, would be for fun. And now I'm like, and my husband's birthday is in a couple of days. So I'm like, oh, I did shed a little tear thinking, well, I asked him what he wanted for his birthday, and he said he wanted to go to school, and, maybe we'll order a cake from the grocery store. Maybe I'll make that homemade cake. It doesn't really matter, but it's symbolic of, yes, I know that this is going to have a profound impact on him and my daughter, who is a sophomore in college, who thankfully is home with us. But when we look at this impact and from a food point of view, would you say this is, I want to say this is unprecedented, but we do have the Great Depression and other previous eras and times in history where we can maybe kind of draw some inferences. But what would you say?
Well, I think your description of, your interest in either buying or making a cake is interesting. But think about this, if we're 6 months into this and many American families don't have the resources to buy something like that, you may almost feel guilty.
Yes.
Having any kind of luxury item or, being able to treat yourself because you know that others are suffering.
Yes.
And so there's going to be an emotional impact of that, not just on those who don't have the resources to do it, but on everybody who's aware of that broader situation. And you mentioned the Great Depression. I think, that's probably a good analogy, because with 9/11, that happened to the United States. There were obviously broad global implications of what happened, but not everybody felt it in the same way. And here, the world is going to have this impact. Supply chains around the world are currently being impacted. So it doesn't matter if the grocery stores are functioning fine if you can't get the ingredients to make your products, because of the country that is a supplier, can't operate either, or they're in lockdown or quarantine. And so it's going to continue to reverberate in ways that, we can't quite imagine. And so I think that for younger people today, I don't think it's quite hit home.
No, not yet.
And that's why I feel like over time, it is going to be there, but there's not going to be that single moment, of a plane crashing into a building to know that it's arrived. And in some ways, psychologically, I think that's going to be a longer term impact on people's mental health, because it's going to be harder to explain why you even feel bad or why are you worried, because things aren't much different today than they were yesterday. And so I think that's going to be what feels very different from some of the past challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. So are there maybe some, I'm always the person that looks on the bright side of things and looks for the silver linings. I fell and broke my hand the other day, and I am honestly just so glad it was me and not one of my kids, not my elderly mother-in-law, not my mom. I say that, and then my husband's like, well, what about me? I'm like, oh, you would have been fine, but I'm like, oh, it could have been so much worse. I didn't need surgery, like all of these things. I do like to look at the bright side. And I hate to say what might be some of the good things to come out of this, but I do want to look at the full picture and what some of these shifts in our food choices or food system. Will we be eating more nutritiously? I know with limited resources, that's tough, but will we be less worried about whether it's gluten-free? Of course, people who have celiac disease need to have, there's a lot of gluten-free foods that are naturally gluten-free. But you know what I'm getting at. Yeah. Are we going, I think the safer our food supply is and the more stable our economy is, the more we can kind of nitpick at the things that don't really mean that a food is safe and nutritious. So is it going to bring us back to the basics on that? Or is there anything within that whole realm that you can speak to?
Yeah, I think you're right. This is going to remind people that there is a big difference between risk and perception of risk. And that's probably a good thing. And people are going to be focused on things that matter more. I suspect that will mean that gluten-free, zero preservatives, a lot of the labels that may not actually mean very much will not have as much of an impact on consumer behavior. We can certainly see that, in people's purchasing decisions right now. I think that it will have a positive impact on reminding people that, you can't take the food for granted, and that, somebody is producing that food, and that there is an entire food distribution chain behind it. So I think it's going to remind people of the importance of the food system, and that's a good thing. So if we're more thoughtful about the food we eat, if we're more thoughtful about how the food is produced, and we're worrying less about things that probably don't matter, I think those are all good things. So in the way that the Depression left its mark on a generation of people that were more cost conscious, I think that, there's a chance that this will leave its impact on people and leave them more focused on, what matters and what doesn't matter in the food they eat.
Yes, and wasting less food, using every scrap. It's interesting because just back in January, I was at an international conference and somebody posed the question, do you think if we valued food more, we would treat it differently? And I had mixed feelings about that because I'm like, people value food. I don't think people are wasting food or being irresponsible because they don't value it. I think and you're the, psychologist expert. I mean, you could speak to that. And maybe that's just my personal bias, but this experience, it is impacting how we value our food.
Yeah, and it's impacting what value means.
Right.
Because a month ago, good value was getting a double portion at Cheesecake Factory. Today, good value is eating exactly what you need.
Right.
And not paying for food that, you're not going to eat, or that's, more than you actually need to consume.
Mm-hmm.
So our definition of value has changed and will change.
Interesting. What else can you tell us about the future of food with regard to this pandemic and the business of food, food systems, consumer psychology?
There's the impact on sustainability and nutrition and health. I think, all of these things are going to come out of it slightly differently. And I think if people are looking at the food they eat from a nutrition standpoint, that there's an opportunity that people will, go back to some of the habits and traits that we were using 50 years ago. When you think about how food has changed, it's not just that, consumers are overeating. Our food landscape has changed. And that choice architecture, has led to some of the challenges that we have. If you go from having a 9-inch plate in 1960 to having a 12-inch plate today, that changes how people eat, whether or not they know it. And, I think that people having a, 16-ounce soda versus a 8-ounce soda when they go to the restaurant, also changes. And so I think that we're going to see some potential improvements in how the nutrition works as well. And those things all then have a knock-on effect in terms of sustainability and environment. If people only buy the food they need, well, Americans throw away, 40% of all food wasted is post-consumer.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a really big opportunity to reduce food waste. And if you reduce the food waste, then food doesn't get produced. And if it doesn't get produced, there's this environmental benefit from it. So looking at how our food system works, I think will tell us a lot about, what are going to be the broader global ramifications of these changes.
And you and I have talked about sustainability on the previous episodes. Do you think this will help consumers be more, I don't want to say open to sustainability, but maybe see it more clearly? That, when we're talking about things that matter and that sustainable nutrition, sustainable food systems, maybe they'll see them differently and be less fearful of them.
Well, if I had to guess, I would say that it'll make people less interested in sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're worried about getting enough food to eat, you're probably less worried about how it's produced. And, that's what I find interesting is that, on one hand, that sounds like a terrible thing if people don't care about sustainability. But on the other hand, if they don't waste food, you end up with a more sustainable food supply.
Right.
And so we often focus on trying to convince people not to do things, but if the behaviors were just different, then we would end up with the result we want anyway. And I run into this a lot when I talk to conservation organizations, and their proposals for protecting the global forest would be, well, if we can build bigger fences, we can keep people out so they won't destroy the rainforest. My feeling is, one, you shouldn't build fences to keep people out who are hungry. And two, if people had enough food, you wouldn't need a fence at all. And so focusing on the fence instead of focusing on the nutrition and feeding people adequately really creates this divide, because you're trying to keep people from doing something that they need to survive instead of making sure they have the resources they need to survive adequately. And then then your interests are aligned.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you this. So from my perspective, I can imagine that consumers will care less about sustainability, or maybe worry less about sustainability. Like you said, just trying to get food on the table, which you and I have talked about, and I've talked about on the show before, was already a reality for so many people being food insecure. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the people producing our food care less or worry less. I mean, the agriculture community is already, working hard to make our food supply sustainable. But that's my perspective and assumption. What would you say to that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. What I find interesting is that, when you talk to environmental groups, they point out that 70% of all freshwater is going to agriculture and 40% of our land is devoted to agriculture. And sort of all of these 80% of deforestation caused by agriculture. And those things are all true, but that's using today as the baseline. And when you use today as the baseline, it feels like farmers are the problem. On the other hand, if we use 1980 as the baseline, what you would find is that we use 50% less water to produce that bushel of corn, that there's 60% less erosion on the land, there are 35% fewer greenhouse gases. And so by every single measure for every single crop, things are wildly better today than they were in the past. And that's why, I encourage environmental groups to use 1980 as our baseline, because then farmers are the solution to the problem. And they're part of the solution, and then they'll partner with you. But if you say they're the problem, it's going to be very hard to convince them to get on board with whatever you're suggesting. So I like to think that, if I was a farmer, I would be happy that consumers finally care about sustainability, because they've been on this journey all along. And it's only now that the consumer is getting on board with them.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but then sometimes when the consumer cares or worries, they don't have their facts straight, and then that makes it a little bit harder for the agriculture community to to do what they need to do.
Well, it's not just that the facts aren't straight. It's that sustainability is complicated, and there's a huge difference between local sustainability and global sustainability. But they're both sustainability. The problem is that when consumers think about sustainability, they think about local sustainability. Is my water clean? Is my air clean? Is there runoff? Are there environmental or health issues locally? But the question is also global. If you look at a region like Europe, they're trying to reduce the amount of fertilizer and insecticide and pesticides and promote small farms and all of those things that sound wonderful. As a result, though, they're just less productive. And so they're importing 70% of their animal feed needs. And the country that sends the most food to Europe is Brazil. So Europe has succeeded in exporting its environmental footprint to the most biodiverse country on the planet. And so while they're promoting local sustainability, they're actually undermining global sustainability. And, that's what's complicated for the consumer, is that this difference between local and global.
Right. I'm glad you shared that. We've talked about that on the show before, and I bring this up too sometimes, is what consumers might hear some statistics about greenhouse gases that are global numbers, but they, of course, think they're local. They think they're U.S. And then we get into how much more efficient the production systems in the U.S. are versus, some developing countries. And like, as you and I have talked before, those differences and those trade-offs, it is very complex. So while we're on the topic of sustainability and the environment, I wanted to ask you, when we look at decreasing food waste and having more sustainable nutrition, more sustainable agriculture, how much does that impact the environment versus transportation industry, those really large carbon footprints. Are we splitting hairs when we're talking about sustainable agriculture?
Well, you're right that it goes to the difference between what's happening in the United States and what's happening globally. In the United States, agriculture is about 4% of greenhouse gas emissions, so it's a relatively small player. But the U.S. is an enormous emitter, so 4% of a big number is still a big number. Globally, agriculture contributes 10 to 15% of all greenhouse gas emissions. When you add in deforestation, 80% of which is caused by agriculture, you're up to 25 or 30%. So that's almost as much as the energy sector, and it's certainly more than anything else. So agriculture definitely has an important role to play. It's just that when you look at efficiency, agriculture is absolutely moving in the right direction. And the question is not, is it good or bad? It's just, is it getting better fast enough? And that's where we need people to focus on, the fact that things are getting better, but not fast enough. So let's help them along. As opposed to, if you're talking about fossil fuels or other things, well, there's a need to move away from some of those and to get our future energy needs in different ways. So it makes sense to talk about moving in other directions. But we're going to see some of that even in the agriculture world. We need to nearly double protein by 2050. And if all of that were to come from alternative protein sources, well, that wouldn't cost any livestock producer any animals at all. And so right now there's this gets back to sort of my mission of de-escalating that tension. Right now you have those who are producing plant-based products or cell-based, lab-grown meat and other things, arguing that we're going to eliminate animal agriculture. Well, they don't need to eliminate animal agriculture. They just need to meet that future demand for doubling the protein. That's already a $1 trillion market opportunity for them. And the chances of them getting to a $1 trillion market within 30 years, that's a pretty big challenge anyway. So why do they have to talk about driving all the dairy producers and livestock producers out of business when it's very unlikely that they're even going to meet the new demand
without them?
Yeah, and so what that does, though, is it encourages livestock producers and others to defend themselves. And then they want to pass legislation that limits the ability of the others to operate. And, then they get mad that they're trying to, create this unlevel playing field. Well, if you tell me you're trying to drive me out of business and, my family isn't going to have a future, I think most people are going to try to push back against that. On the other hand, if you say, we're going to work with you to meet future demand in a more sustainable way, well, what's the problem there?
I love it. I always love plants and animals together and working together, being part of the solution. Well, Jack, as we're wrapping up, I want to highlight your new blog series. I love it. It is addressing some of these consumer fears and how our brains sometimes lead us to make bad decisions about the food we eat. And I don't mean, I have a craving for some M&Ms or something. I mean decisions that have to do with the halo effect and the naturalness bias and confirmation bias and this decision fatigue. So could you tell us a little bit about your blog series? And of course, I'll have links to all of this in my show notes at soundbitesrd.com.
Yeah. So, what I found is that a lot of what people are worried about are the things that other people tell them to worry about. And that a lot of this has to do with just how our brains work. If I say something is natural, the naturalness bias makes me feel like, it's probably better. And as soon as you think something is better because it's natural, you start to think, it's probably healthier too. And things which may or may not have anything to do with each other. And rather than look at this, I'm not a nutritionist and, I'm not a doctor. So instead of talking about sort of the actual health differences between these products, what I want people to think about is, how does my mind work and how is it influencing the decisions I make? And if I understand that, can I make better decisions? And what I found is that, people watch TED Talks online all the time and they learn about strange new topics because they're having fun. People are delivering information in a way that's accessible and interesting. So if you lead people to knowledge, it's better than beating people up with science. And so for me, I was hoping that this series would allow people to learn something new about how their own brains operate and have fun while they were doing it. And they would come out of it with a better understanding of, the food choices they make, but mostly they would just be enjoying themselves. And if we can make information more accessible generally so that people feel like they're having fun, we're not going to have to beat people up so much and get them to do the right thing. They're just going to know what the right thing is, and they're naturally going to do that.
I love it. Yeah, it's like they feel better. They can listen to themselves in a different way and trust themselves. Because you talk about why you shouldn't trust your brain, and fostering fear doesn't help us eat healthier. But at the end of the day, if they just feel better about it, and I love the graphics that you have throughout the blog post, not just, the title graphic, but within each blog post, you have these little, I think they're really shareable images. I know I'll be cutting and pasting them and putting them into my tweets and so on. The snappy little quotes, and you have your little cartoon character of yourself, which is really cute. Yeah, I just think it is very shareable and accessible information, and it's enjoyable to read and to learn from.
I think the halo effect is a good example that, it turns out that about 90 to 95% of people that are buying plant-based burgers are doing it for health reasons, and yet it's not a healthier product. Mm-hmm. And, it's not a criticism of a plant-based burger that it's not healthier. In fact, you probably don't want it to be healthier because you want it to taste just as good.
Yeah.
And so, it's probably better for the product that it's an indulgence, just like a regular burger is an indulgence. But there is a concern, though, when 90% of people are doing it for one reason, and that's not actually the case, because then they may end up eating more burgers than they should because they have this feeling that it's a healthier product. Now, the people producing it may be doing it for environmental reasons, but if people are consuming it for a different reason, then they should be aware of that and how we can get misled into tricking ourselves into doing these things.
Right. Yeah. You and I have talked about transparency before, and my hope, if I could wave a magic wand, is that people would just get the information and it would be really direct and clear, and they could make their choices, but kind of take the marketing out of the picture. And I know that's never going to happen, but like the Dirty Dozen, you have a post on that and how this negative fear mongering does not lead to healthier choices. And, you talk about sharing this information in a way that's fun, but you share a lot of science, but you're not beating people up with it. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, well, I spent too many years at the State Department doing global food policy, beating people up with science. And, it took a long time to learn that wasn't as effective as other ways of delivering it.
Well, and you mentioned TED Talks. You have an awesome TED Talk that I'll link to. It's Why We Fear the Food We Eat. And I've known you for a few years, but I have a hard time believing that this isn't just an extension of your personality, and that you've always had this approach to really connect in a real way that, like you said, is not beating people up. So thank you for all the important work you're doing.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And thanks for coming on the show today and talking about a tough topic and giving us a glimpse into the future. And hopefully it will be brighter than we might think.
Yep. We all have to stay hopeful. Thank you.
Yes. All right. And for everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind. Till next time.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. Music by Dave Burke, produced by Jag in Detroit Podcasts.